Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Rage22. Welcome back to my channel. If you guys remember, I already reviewed this game on my channel, Outlast 2. Uh, and I'm just gonna say this right now. I believe that the very first Outlast game, I've said this before as well on my channel, the very first Outlast game to me is a bit overrated. And one of the reasons why I find Outlast 1 overrated is because of how people saw Outlast 2 because of Outlast 1. When Outlast 2 first dropped, it was met with a lot of criticism for a lot of stupid reasons, in my own personal opinion. I remember one of the very first criticisms I heard was Outlast 2 relied on shock value instead of actually just having scary moments in the game. And that's a criticism that I find very, very stupid. And throughout this video, you're going to see that a lot of the criticisms that people have for Outlast 2, those very same criticisms can easily be applied to Outlast 1. So that's why, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense why people didn't like Outlast 2 because apparently Outlast 1 was so much of a better game. Like, I really don't get it. But now to the shock value part. People believe that Outlast 2, like, it relies on just really gory moments and uh, just tries to show you lots of body horror and relies on only that to scare the player. But that's actually not true. Outlast 2 is a lot more than just a gore fest survival horror game. Yes, there's a lot of gore, but the game has many other ways of scaring the player, and that's what makes Outlast 2 not only a great horror game, but possibly one of the scariest psychological survival horror games of all time. And we'll get back to the psychological and survival aspect. Throughout this video, I'm going to basically be not only showing why Outlast 2 was a great game, but also showing why it was better than the first game. Now, starting off with the criticisms that people had, people said that Outlast 2 was too gory and just relied on shock value. Well, in Outlast 1, if you remember, there was an inmate that we see masturbating on top of a pile of mutilated dead bodies. If that doesn't sound like over shock value and too much body horror, I honestly don't know what does. The very first Outlast had so much gore. By the second half of the game, I was pretty much desensitized to it. That's how much gore was in the very first Outlast. And the gore that you see in Outlast 1, that very same type of gore can be seen in Outlast 2. So when people use, the too much gore and too much overly shock value for Outlast 2, that same thing is in Outlast 1. So how could you criticize a game and think that another game is better than that game for having the very same thing that you're criticizing the other game for? And in this case, people criticized Outlast 2 because it had too much gore. Well, guess what? Outlast 1 has just as much as that apparently too much gore. So if you think that Outlast 2 was bad because it only relied on body horror and a lot of gore to scare the player, well, you could very well say the same thing about Outlast 1 because Outlast 1 had just as much gore as Outlast 2. And I'd say it's almost the same amount as well. Like in Outlast Whistleblower, our protagonist Wayland Park almost gets his dick cut off. Well, in Outlast 2, our character's dick actually does get cut off. And in Outlast 1, you see a lot of mutilated dead bodies. As a matter of fact, that's mostly the only gore you see in Outlast 1. And it's pretty much the only gore you see in Outlast 2 as well. So, people saying that, like, using that excuse and that criticism, oh, it had too much gore. Outlast 2 it's not that scary because it only relies on shock value. It's too much gore. Well, that same criticism can easily be applied to Outlast 1 because it literally has the same thing that you are criticizing this game for. So that's why that one criticism of Outlast 2 really doesn't make sense. Another criticism I saw is the fact that Outlast 2 was too different and, people didn't like because it wasn't the same story or like it wasn't a true sequel to Outlast 1. Well, that's because Outlast 2 is the start of an anthology that Red Barrels is most likely making. But that's probably going to be out the door because, as you guys know, Outlast Trials is going to be set back inside of an asylum. But that's probably because of you people who criticize Outlast 2 for having a different approach, taking a different approach, and trying something different. Like, I don't understand you people. Why do you guys want more of the same? And then when you actually do get more of the same, you still got something to whine about. I mean, you say that Call of Duty games are too similar to each other, And yet people wanted Outlast 2 to be more like Outlast 1. Like, I don't understand you people. Like, what do you want? Every time, every single time a developer tries something new, you criticize them for it. Every time they do something similar to the first game, you still criticizing them for it. Like, seriously, do you punks always gotta whine about shit? And yes, I understand that the story and the setting of Outlast 1 was really good, okay? I totally get that. But if Red Barrels did not take a different approach and actually try something new for Outlast 2, then it would have been too easy because if they were just going to do the same thing they did with Outlast 1, it would have been too easy because all they would have had to done was they just would have made another horror game set inside of an asylum. Yes, it would be different, there'd be like, different gameplay, different enemies, a different story, etc., etc. But Red Barrels was just being creative when they decided to give Outlast 2 a different setting and a different story and different characters. So that was another really, really stupid criticism, honestly. And now we're going to be talking about some of the great things that Outlast 2 actually done right. Now, the first thing I want to talk about real quick, and I don't usually do this, but it's going to be the story. The story of Outlast 2 may be confusing at first, but honestly, if the developer just quickly showed you what the story of their game was, wouldn't that be a little too boring and a little too easy? I mean, in Outlast 2, it's more of a mystery, and the developers, Red Barrels, like, they actually force you to uncover the mystery of the story yourself by reading all of the documents and reading all of the stuff inside the game, and it forces you to put the pieces together, and that makes figuring out the overall story of the game so much better. I mean, imagine if they just drew it right in your face. Imagine if they just gave you a hint so big that it literally explained the whole story with just that one hint. No, that would be stupid. The story of Outlast 2 is brilliant. Not only is the story great, but it's also connecting Outlast 2's story to Outlast 1 with a really, really good plot twist. So when people criticized Outlast 2's story, it's probably because they were too confused and were just too stupid to actually try and figure it out. Because figuring out the story for a game and piecing it together like you're solving some kind of mystery, it feels great. And it makes you appreciate that story so much more, especially when you realize how good the story actually is after you figure it out. And the story for Outlast 2 is no exception. The reason why the villagers and Knott's cult, the reason why they're as crazy as they are is because the Murkoff towers, which of course you don't know, Murkoff are the same assholes from the first game. Basically, they have these Murkoff towers that were set in the foresty area that Outlast 2 takes place, and basically every time it flashes, it makes people hallucinate, and depending on what's going on inside that person's head, that'll determine what the Murkoff Towers makes them see. So this is why Knott's people were as crazy as they were, and that's why they were that's why they actually believed that they were getting messages from God, and they actually believe what Knott was saying to him, because the Murkoff Towers was actually making them see it with the hallucination. So you see how it all comes together? It was a recipe for disaster, and that's one of the awesome things about Outlast 2's story. Not only is the story brilliant and actually doing something different, but it even connects Outlast 2 to Outlast 1. So the story for Outlast 2 is great, and not only do we get the story of Knopf and his cult, but we also get a really fleshed out story for our protagonist, Blake Langerman, as well. And I gotta say, man, Blake Langerman was a really underrated protagonist as well. Yes, his dialogue wasn't the best, but you feel for him. You could say he suffered just as much as the protagonist of the first two games, because not only was Blake suffering because he was literally getting tortured in some aspects and getting hurt and getting just fighting for survival, but he was also suffering mentally as well. So Blake went through so much shit. Not only was he fighting for survival against the people who were literally trying to kill him no matter where he went, but then he was suffering mentally as well. So Blake was such an underrated protagonist. He suffered just as much as Outlast 1's protagonist, Miles Upshur. So, and the guy talks as well, so it makes him seem more alive. I mean, Miles never said a word. All he did was write in his stupid little journal. It made him seem like he was more of a robot than an actual protagonist. So, Blake is also just such an underrated protagonist as well. Another great thing about Outlast 2 is its actual setting. Now, yes, Mount Massive Asylum was a horrifying place to be. The level design was amazing. It had plenty of tension. Um, You can never expect what will be around the corner, and that provided even more tension and fear for the player because you never knew what was going to be around the corner. You never knew what to expect. But all that's turned up so much more in Outlast 2 because not only is Outlast 2 bigger, but there's a lot more tension since the setting is a lot more, well, let's just say terrifying. Because think about it. In Outlast 1, at least you knew there was a way out. At least you knew that beyond the walls of Mount Massive Asylum, there was the outside world and a chance to escape. But in Outlast 2, you're in the middle of nowhere. There is no escape. Even if you could escape not people, this flock or whatever, and all the other crazy psychos in the in this area of Outlast 2, you're still in the middle of nowhere. You're still not going to be able to get help because you're literally in the middle of nowhere. And the setting is also brilliant as well. I mean, the fact that we see this terrifying cult who have pretty much built their own little fucked up society in the middle of nowhere, and now you're right in the middle of a war going on between this cult and another cult which is satanic and they're trying to kill each other and you're caught up right in the crossfire. It makes for a really, really fun time. And also, it's another really, really good idea. The ideas that Red Barrels put in this game were brilliant, and this is one of the reasons why I can't see why people hated this game. I just can't see it. Like, how could you people have such stupid taste? I don't get it. Back to the setting. The setting for Outlast 2 is great. It really is. The level design is awesome. And another criticism I see is that people thought it was too big and this led to people just getting killed while being chased. Well, listen, you're supposed to pay attention to the actual environment. That's the key to actually playing this game. Okay, that doesn't mean the game sucks. That just means that your skill at the game are lacking. Okay? You shouldn't blame a game for your own lack of skill and your own lack of actually figuring stuff out. Because if you can't figure anything out, then you shouldn't be playing video games in the first place, you piece of shit. And not only that, but again, this very same criticism for Outlast 2 could easily be applied to Outlast 1. There were moments in Outlast 1 where the player had no idea where the hell they were going and they had a guy chasing them. You have to figure stuff out. You have to pay attention to the actual level. And not only that, but there are hints in Outlast 2's level design that show you where you're supposed to go. You just have to actually pay attention and not be a fucking idiot. And again, back to the setting part, the setting for Outlast 2 is really, really good. Not only is it bigger, but it's also a more terrifying situation because you are literally in the middle of nowhere filled with crazy people who want to do nothing but brutally kill you and your wife. Like, what could be better than that? Yes, the Asylum is good, but I'm not saying Outlast 2 setting is like way better than Mount Massive Asylum. I'm saying that they're both good. And this is one of the reasons why it's a good thing why Red Barrels did a different approach for Outlast 2. You've got one fantastic survival horror game that takes place inside of an asylum, and you have another brilliant horror game that takes place in an even more terrifying environment and setting, which is, of course, the absolute middle of nowhere. But it's not really the middle of nowhere because obviously you've got these fucked up houses that were built by the cult, and that makes it all the more terrifying. And not only that, but also makes for a lot more better chases as well. Like, the fact that you have houses that you could hide in and also could help you during chases, it's great. Like, there are moments in Outlast 2 where you could, like, hide inside of a house. The enemies will break into a window. You jump out of a window, try and run to another house, or just try and go, like, somewhere else to hide. It's great. And not only that, but now we're going to be talking about Outlast 2's actual gameplay mechanics. Outlast 2's gameplay mechanics are absolutely amazing and are such an improvement on Outlast 1. The first thing I want to talk about real quick is a bit of a cheeky little gameplay mechanic is the camera. I am so glad that Red Barrels actually improved how the camera works in Outlast 2. In Outlast 1, the camera wasn't used for that much, honestly. It was just used for, seeing in the dark, but the use of the camera is turned up a lot more in Outlast 2. Not only does it look better, the night vision in general, and not only does it go so much better with the game's graphics, which we'll talk about in a bit, but now there's actually a sound mechanic in the camera, making the camera all the more useful, and also makes it a lot more immersive for stealth players who actually like to be sneaky for myself. Another great mechanic is the stealth as well. In Outlast 1, yes, there is an option to be stealthy, but in Outlast 2, it is turned up all the way. A good example of this is like when you hide in a closet, you can actually peek to see if someone may be on the other side just waiting to kill you, which makes it even more terrifying. And when you put that with the sound enhancement mechanic on the camera, it makes the game all the more immersive. You feel like you're actually there because of how many realistic mechanics the game is giving you. Because in Outlast 1, you couldn't peek or do anything, and your camera didn't have the sound enhancement mechanic. But in Outlast 2, not only can you peek while you're hiding in a closet, but you could even peek when you open up a door. Something that I really felt should have been in Outlast 1, because yes, there was kind of a peeking mechanic in Outlast 1, but in Outlast 2, it's improved heavily. Now you could actually peek behind a door ever so slightly, just see if there might be something horrible waiting for you on the other side, which also raises the tension. Another great mechanic is the actual running. In Outlast 1, you had infinite sprint, and the enemies didn't really run that fast. This made it very, very easy to play. And not only that, but Outlast 1 is an easy game in general. The difficulty is turned up tremendously in Outlast 2. Your character Blake runs fast, but he also has a stamina bar, which I actually had a problem with myself at first, but now I realize that the danger level is turned up a lot more in Outlast 2, which is why you can't actually be cocky during a chase like you could in Outlast 1. Because remember, in Outlast 1, you had infinite sprint, and the enemies didn't even run that fast, except for Wall Rider, because, that motherfucker floats. But in Outlast 2, the threat level is turned up so much more, and not only does it make it a lot more scarier, but this also improves the game as well, because now there's more tension, because you know that if you're being chased for too long, eventually your character Blake is going to run out of stamina. So this makes the game even more scarier. And of course, the last great mechanic I want to talk about is the slide mechanic. A very, very minor mechanic, but hey, all the more better, right? Another thing I want to talk about is how Outlast 2 blends survival horror and psychological horror so well. This is honestly one of the best things about Outlast 2, because not only is Outlast 2 just a casual survival horror game, but it is also a really fucked up mind game with its psychological elements. Because let me tell you something, Outlast 2's psychological elements make this as terrifying as Visage or any of those other supernatural horror games that you play. Outlast 2 almost is a supernatural horror game. You could tell there's something paranormal going on in the actual reality of the game, but one thing I want to say about the psychological segments, which are aka the school sections are so good. And the reason for that is because every time you are transported back to Blake's old school, which is of course an hallucination, but besides the point, every time every time the game actually puts you back inside the school, it gets terrifying every time you get there. Each time you get teleported back to the school, it gets more and more psychologically terrifying. More paranormal events happen. The first time you're transported to the school, it's not that bad. It's a little, it's spooky, but it's not that bad. But each time you are transported to the school, like the school sections get even more terrifying each time you're teleported over there, or every time Blake hallucinates. And this makes Outlast 2 not only a great survival horror game, but a really great psychological game as well. Because those psychological moments from the school sections, the fact that they get more and more terrifying every time you actually get transported over there, brings even more tension. Because you know that the more times you get transported to the school, the more terrifying it's going to get. And this actually ties back to the story. The Murkoff towers that make you hallucinate, they make you go more insane every time they actually make you hallucinate and fuck with your head. And this explains why the school sections get more and more nightmarish for Blake, because it's literally making his sanity decrease because of the Murkoff towers. This is brilliant. Outlast 2 is brilliant. You people are fucking wrong. The last thing I want to talk about is the actual chapters. The first chapter is, it's pretty standard stuff. You're surviving, you're completing minor objectives, but I love how each chapter of the game actually has so much variety. An example of this would be like the main nemesis that chases you. In the first chapter, it's Marta and, Knott's flock. But in the second chapter, you're being chased by people with syphilis and a jockey type enemy that can shoot arrows at you. And this makes things so much more terrifying, because now we have ranged enemies as well. The game has so much variety, and I love how it uses its chapters to bring that variety, because each new chapter brings in new elements to the game. The first chapter was pretty obviously generic, not generic, just, standard stuff. You're surviving, you're being chased by Marta, who was one of the game's big bads. And you're being chased by enemies who are, pretty standard, just the guys with machetes that chase you. But then in the second chapter, not only are you being chased by a ranged enemy who could insta-kill you on nightmare difficulty, but you're also being chased by these little crawly dudes, and they're super, super freaky, because they crawl like animals. Like, they've lost so much of their humanity, they don't even walk on their two legs anymore. They walk on all fours. They chase you on all fours, and it's terrifying. And that is one of the great varieties of the second chapter. And then in the third chapter, you are being chased by super fast, terrifying enemies with machetes, and they seem more like zombies actually. But in the third chapter, this is also where the school demon from the psychological school sections also becomes a lot more apparent and a lot more frequent. And then of course you get Val, who is the game's final boss. So yeah, guys, this is why I believe Outlast 2 is, such a great game. From its amazing mechanics to its levels to its atmosphere and even its setting, the setting that's so good. And another thing I want to talk about real quick is the chapters not only bring in variety from the enemies that you face and chase you and the objectives, but even the environments change. Like, for example, in the third chapter takes place inside of a mine, a really, really spooky mine, and it's super, super claustrophobic, which really reminds you of the first Outlast. And the second chapter takes place like a deeper part of the foresty area, and then we see those little creepy crawly dudes, and the guy with the who could insta kill you with his bow and arrow. It makes for an even more terrifying time. And again, that variety is through the roof. So yeah, guys, Outlast 2, this was one of the most underrated survival horror games I ever played. You see, when people hate a game for absolutely no reason without even trying it, they will only see that game for the things it done wrong instead of what the game actually does right, because they haven't even played it themselves. Hell, I bet most of the people who thought Outlast 2 was disappointing, they probably didn't even play it that long. They didn't understand the story because they didn't care to actually read the notes in the game. They didn't care about the game's gameplay mechanics because they were too busy getting killed because they were probably trashed at the game. Like, seriously, this is a great horror game. And it really pains me when people don't recognize something brilliant. They're not smart enough. They don't have enough faith. Like, seriously. It's okay if you don't like the game, but this is not a bad horror game. Outlast 2 is an amazing horror game. It is a survival horror masterpiece, and so is the first Outlast. There's no use in fighting because both of these games had great ways of providing a great survival horror experience, and I think that's what anyone would want, especially if you're playing a horror game in the first place. So, Outlast 2, an amazing game. And yes, this counts as a new review. Not only a discussion, but a new review because my actual review of Outlast 2 is not very good. And in terms of criticisms, the criticisms that I have, the only criticism I really have for the game is kind of with its difficulty setting. When you play the game on normal and hard mode, for some reason the enemies don't run really fast. And I didn't like this too much because, like, in Outlast 1, the enemies ran regardless whether you played on normal, hard, or nightmare. But for some reason, in Outlast 2, when you play on normal and hard mode, the enemies don't even run. They walk after you. Only on nightmare, they actually run after you. So that's pretty much the only thing I had. That's the only gripe I had with the game, honestly. The other gripe I really had was the characters. The characters, they're good, but I felt like they could have been a little bit better. Especially Lynn, Blake's wife. She barely had any character development, and throughout the game, that's who you're trying to save. So to be honest, like, since I barely knew the bitch, it definitely kind of felt a little kind of a waste of time because I don't even know this woman. The game spends so much time focusing on Jessica. It's like the game forgets about Lynn, but what I've realized is the game is trying to put you in the mindset of Blake. Because since Blake is having these hallucinations from the Murkoff Towers and keeps seeing Jessica, he himself starts to forget about Lynn and wants to save Jessica again, even though she's already dead. And that's what the game is trying to do to us. The game also wants us to forget about Lynn to put us in the actual mindset of Blake as well, because that's what Blake is feeling. Because the hallucinations that he's seeing and we're seeing, the reason why the game focuses so much on Jessica is because that's what Blake is focused on because of the hallucinations that he's having. So, again, kind of a criticism, but it's also kind of a brilliant one. It's like a brilliant criticism. So, yeah. My last criticism for the game, my last criticism is the cutscenes. Really wish there was a way to skip the cutscenes, because if you're playing on insane mode and you get killed, which you're obviously going to get, it's really a pain in the ass being forced to watch those cutscenes again. But other than that, Outlast 2, this was an amazing game. And whatever critics you may see, especially Angry Joe, like seriously, Angry Joe fucking sucks. Okay, Angry Joe absolutely sucks. His review of this game was the stupidest, ignorant thing I ever seen. Like seriously, Angry Joe, more like Biased Joe, How do you give Resident Evil 2 Remake a higher score than Outlast 2? Like, seriously, I'm not trying to sound entitled, but seriously, Angry Joe's review of Outlast 2 was terrible. And that's probably why so many people actually didn't want to play Outlast 2, because Angry Joe is so popular. But seriously, Angry Joe's a fucking biased. He clearly is. I mean, the dude loves the games that everyone else loves, and he hates the game that everyone else hates. I mean, the dude's a fucking bias, okay? Don't listen to Angry Joe. You want a true quality review? Come to us smaller YouTubers, because us smaller YouTubers, we actually are very, very humble with our channels and our videos. Making this video was a great experience for you guys. I love talking to you. I love making this video for you. Don't listen to these bigger YouTubers like Angry Joe and, all these other shitty reviewers, okay? Their reviews are biased and they're not telling you the truth, okay? Angry Joe only wants you to play Resident Evil. I want you to play other horror games as well. Other indie horror games that are good, like this one. And how can I forget? The graphics, don't even get me started. The graphics are simply outstanding for Outlast 2. And the soundtrack, how could I forget? I gotta punch myself in the dick for forgetting the soundtrack. This game's soundtrack alone makes it an experience to be had, an experience that you need to have. This game's soundtrack is absolutely horrifying, but horrifying in the best way. So yeah, guys, this was my re-review of Outlast 2 and also explaining why this game was as underrated as it was. Let me know if you guys want to see more underrated horror games being covered on this channel. If you guys have an underrated horror game that you would like to see be covered on this channel, if you want me to talk about it, don't forget I have every horror game on Xbox, so as long as it's not on PC, I most likely have it. You all know me, I'm the world's biggest horror fan, so if you guys have any horror games in mind that you thought were underrated and should be covered and deserve a second chance, let me know and I'll be very happy to cover it on the channel, because let me tell you something, guys. I have a real big soft spot for underrated games, especially horror games. So, yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. Before I go, I'd like to make a couple of shout outs. First shout out goes to M64 Bros, a really good friend. Second shout out goes to my buddy Jake, Frosty Jake on Xbox. So, yeah, keep up with that story, Jake, by the way. You keep up with that story. The guy's writing his own story, so, yeah, check him out as well if you could. But, yeah, guys, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And, yeah, thanks so much for watching, guys. This was Mr. Rage 22 signing off. Bye-bye, guys, and don't be a hater. Have a good one.